Hello again, Internet back here. I want to talk a little bit about the history of martial arts. Now, people have been fighting each other pretty much since people have been around. People fight for resources, they fight because they're screwed up in the head, they fight over love or desire, they fight over, all sorts of reasons. So, way back in the day, people were fighting when we were living in caves. Now, a long time ago, somebody figured out that using some sort of tool makes it much more effective. Taking a rock and bashing it over somebody's head is much more effective than hitting someone with your fist. Now, sharpening that rock, chiseling at it, and having a sharper object is even more effective. And if you go, back in history, there's swords that date back over 5,000 years ago. I mean, that's 5,000 years at least that we've been coming up with some sort of a sharp object to attack each other. Well, if you want to actually get, good at fighting, again, it takes practice with another opponent. And if you're practicing actually using these sharp objects with one another, you're going to end up killing each other. So, people kind of figured out was that, swords and all these objects, well, this does require close range combat. So that's, you're taking this weapon, for the most part, it was coming using gravity to hack down on somebody else. Well, if you do that, the other guy is going to try to, do something to block. They're going to try to get a hold of your wrist or something like that. And that's called grappling. Now that you actually have a hold, if I have a hold of your wrist and now that you have a hold of my wrist, well, now we're using grappling moves. We're trying to deflect and flow with each other's energy in order to get our weapon past the other person's guard and hit that other guy. So this is really how grappling and striking arts evolved over time. People want to figure out how to get better at fighting, and they don't want to kill their friend. They want to practice with their friends. So if you take those same weapons, drop the weapon on the ground, forget the weapon, and you got a hold of each other's wrists and just start from there, well, the entire goal is dominant positioning for the most part, getting past the other person, being able to get that hit in, and then you reset. So if you look at martial arts around the world, pretty much all of them have some sort of a neutral position that you start in, and most of them you start off in physical contact with each other. Not all of them, but the majority of them you start off in contact with one another. Now, wrestling itself was introduced in the Olympics back in 700 BC. So we know that there's been systems of combat and people training in this, enough people to have a desire to have it in the Olympics, at least that far back, probably much farther back. The oldest system that we're aware of would probably be pancration out of Greece. Now that dates back to about 650 BC or so, and there's chiselings of people chiseled in stone of men in different positions with one another. That essentially what it looks like are people in fighting stances in different positions doing different things. It's these different fighting positions, which would, modern day, that would essentially be a book with pictures on fighting. And, around that region, there's a whole lot of other combat styles that developed, that really developed, about 100 years later. I mean, they were, around 550, 500, 450 BC. All these different styles sprung out of China and India, where they were really getting into systems of fighting. And one reason for this could be Alexander the Great around, I think it was 620 BC. Him and his armies kind of went and took over most of Asia and Northeast Africa, and really had a huge empire. And due to a lack of infrastructure, it kind of collapsed. It's difficult to communicate back in those times with such a huge area to try to control. So, for whatever reason, didn't work out so well. But these other systems of fighting developed out of those areas, and all these different systems of fighting actually had very similar moves that you see in pancration, different elements to them. So it's arguably that pancration is sort of the father of all these other martial arts. Not to say that people didn't have different systems of fighting already, but I think it's pretty clear by my own research that they incorporated a lot of these moves that they saw in combat that was effective against them. they didn't want to lose to in the future, so they adapted, they learned. That's what people do. So, every region gets its own system of fighting. All these regions sort of develop over time. They clash in combat, and they learn from one another, and that's how martial arts develop. Now, a lot of these developed in a whole lot of different ways. Some of them focus more on the wrestling aspect. Some of them focus more on stand-up striking. Some do power punches. Some do rapid punches. Some of them are totally focused on kicking each other. The legs are very powerful, so it's a very effective thing to do. Now, as far as weapon fighting goes, again, back to swords, sword technology continued to develop over the years. Originally, it was these large, heavy objects that just sort of had to be hacked at one another. And eventually, as metallurgy evolved, swords got thinner, they got lighter, and they got longer over time. So you had better reach. Doesn't take a whole lot of pressure to pierce through a person's skin. Right around the 1600, developed the rapier, which is a very long, thin blade that was essentially used from a pretty far range to poke at one another. And before that, it was again heavy blades, and people were using heavy armor to try to defend themselves against these heavy blades. Well, that heavy armor kind of makes you move real slow and bulky, and somebody who's real quick and light on their feet with a real long, pokey blade would sort of be able to dance around that other guy and just sort of get in through the gaps with that blade. So armor became less and less used because of this. Now, people, again, want to be able to train without killing each other. So, if you take that blade, well, let's try dropping that blade and just, simulate the movement by using our fist. And, sitting there with that fist with each other and trying to kind of dance around and get that fist out there, the longest possible range possible, that you can do. Now, this is how modern day boxing evolved from this. There's a point-based system, and more rules, got applied over the years, and more padding to help protect one another. But that was basically all it was fencers who didn't want to hurt each other develop boxing systems. And boxing sort of got convoluted over the years where, people just started working on being big and tough and ignoring those long-range jabs and just sort of swinging at one another. And I think it was Jack Dempsey who called that the downfall of boxing. He's referred to as bearcat men, and people that just didn't really use science behind their fighting. They just sort of charged in and swung. What's been shown is that it's really a combination of both, about developing your power and your ability to be able to do really good damage on impact, but also the longest range possible, that straight lead, and rotating your entire body into that so that you're able to strike your opponent from a longer range. And that's essentially, how boxing came about. So anyway, that was just sort of a brief history on martial arts, what it is. Just wanted to go over that real quick. There's a lot more involved in that. There's, if you look at, like Shaolin Kung Fu is a very popular thing. It's very popular on TV, different movies and stuff like that. And that's kind of an interesting thing. It was, from my understanding, it was these Buddhist monks in China who weren't really exercising. They were just sort of meditating. And this guy from India came through there, stayed in the monastery, saw that these guys weren't in very good shape. They weren't able to meditate properly. So this India guy, he taught them these different stretches and exercises that he had learned over the years in order to be healthy, be in shape, and taught it to them. So they started incorporating their meditation with all these different exercises. And as they were meditating, doing these exercises over the years, they'd see different animals in nature, and they started applying these different moves to nature. And that's where you got all these, monkey form and tiger claw and dragon form and all this stuff, was essentially through, them growing out of this, it was just physical